Hi everybody, this video is a overview and sort of preview of some upcoming assignments. A little bit later in the course you have a series of related assignments. So in this video I want to build on what you've already learned in the first 2 weeks of the course and give you a few more details and also just sort of walk you through how these assignments are going to unfold. So that's really the goal of this. We're going to focus in on the assignments that are sort of ethnographic in nature, all right? And again, I'll go through them individually. You already have information about them in the syllabus and in the handouts. So let us get going. Okay, I want to start by saying that by the time you're watching this video, you want to have completed the other elements in week 2. So that means having read the several readings about research activities and research methods in anthropology, and especially having watched lecture 2, which is about fieldwork and research methods and research ethics, okay? Those are sort of the background to what I'm going to talk about now. I'm going to reference that lecture 2. So if you're at this video and you haven't done that other stuff, stop this, go back, make sure you read and watch those things, and then come back to this, okay? These are the assignments that are built on the idea that you already know the stuff from those readings and video, okay? All right. So in lecture 2, I give you an overview of research practices in cultural anthropology, right? In general, the kind of research that cultural anthropologists do is often referred to as ethnography or ethnographic research, okay? And what that means, as I talked about in the video, is that anthropologists have a sort of technique or protocol for trying to understand how people live their lives, imagine their worlds, etc. And that is to spend a lot of time in the actual community where culture is taking place, right? So spending extended time living in a community, and while there, engaging in a whole bunch of different kinds of methods, techniques for collecting information. So 2 of the key methods that anthropologists use are observation and interviewing. Again, I gave you an overview of those in the lecture. I want to extend that conversation, so remind you of what I said in the lecture, and then go into a bit more detail. Because, in fact, these 2 methods are what you are going to be basically working on through this set of assignments that I'm going to discuss in this video. Okay, this is sort of the basis for all of those assignments. So it's really important that you understand, again, what observation and interviewing are, and how you're going to employ them doing the assignments for this course. Okay. All right. At their most fundamental level, observation and interviewing are sort of really simple, right? Observation is, looking at stuff, seeing things, recording what you see. Interviewing is talking to people, having conversations, and recording what you hear. Now, in the context of doing research, we want to be a little bit more sort of purposeful and careful about how we do that watching or looking and conversing. So in other words, these are similar to things we do every day, but we're going to do them in a little bit more of an intensive way since we're doing them in a research setting, right? You have conversations all day long. The next day, probably you could remember some of what you talked about, what you learned, but probably not all of it. So we're doing something here where we want to both have those conversations, do those observations, and also capture that information so that we can apply it later to our own analysis of some cultural setting, okay? So observation. The key distinction I made in the lecture video is between observation and participant observation. Participant observation is sort of a hallmark of cultural anthropological research. It has been from the beginning. And it's basically what it sounds like. It's learning while doing, right? The idea that you are observing something, and one of the ways you're observing it is, or learning about it, is by participating in it. Cultural anthropologists also do more kind of detached observation, where you're more sitting on the sidelines, right? The key thing with both of those techniques, they're both important, is first watching carefully and noting as many details of what you're observing as possible, and then recording those details in some way, all right? So again, this is not a casual, you're not just kind of glancing at what's happening. You're watching carefully and trying to take note of as many different elements as you can. What's going on in the room? Is there music? Is there a smell? Is there a sound? Right? What's on the walls? What are people doing? What are they doing now? Right? Like in real time, how do things unfold in that space over whatever period you're watching? So that's really important, that sort of very detailed part of this is really just about paying attention, paying careful attention to what's happening, right? It's about focus. So that, but then also you need to capture that somehow, right? The most basic way that anthropologists capture what they observe is what we call field notes, which is really basic. It's just writing down what you see, right? If you're working somewhere where you have to use a writing implement, like you don't have access to electricity or whatever, then it's literally like jotting things down in a little notebook, right? That's kind of the classic field note for cultural anthropologists. You can, of course, given especially where you guys are going to be doing your research, use your phone, take notes on your phone. If you are sitting down and can use a laptop, type up your notes into a Word doc or whatever. But the main thing is the idea that you are able to capture a lot more information and remember it and have it to use later if you do it in real time while you're observing, right? If you observe something and then you write what you saw the next day, you will have already lost a lot of those details, okay? So field notes. Now, we can also use other kinds of ways to document things that we observe. One of the most obvious ways is to visually document things with, say, photographs or video, okay? And that's something you're also going to be using for this class, okay? So that's observation. Interviewing, as I said, asking people questions, and then recording in some way, capturing what they tell you. In the lecture video, I made a couple of distinctions about different kinds of interviewing. The one I really want to focus on now, as we're, again, building our sort of backdrop to these assignments, is the difference between structured and unstructured interviews. And then I also want to talk about, sort of within that, interview questions, right? So, yeah, you're going to ask people questions. Well, what kind of questions are you going to ask them? So let's talk about that for a minute. Okay. So, structured versus unstructured interviews. The idea with a structured interview is that you are going to come up with your questions, sequence them as you see best, and then you're going to basically enact that interview consistently in the same way across all the people you interview, right? So you're going to use that same set of questions. You're going to stick to that script. You're not going to sort of throw something else in. You're not going to change the order. It's really about trying to hold constant what you ask and how you ask it across multiple people. That's structured. For your assignments for this class, you're going to use unstructured interviews, okay? Unstructured interviews sort of start the same way that a structured interview does, in the sense that you're going to compose questions. You're going to go into this conversation with this person with your set of questions prepared. However, you're not going to be sort of stuck to that script completely. If during the conversation your interviewee brings up something interesting that you didn't even know was a thing, right? So you therefore hadn't written a question about it, you can pivot to that. You can ask follow-up questions, right? It's a looser kind of approach to interviewing. You still have your questions. It's not a completely open-ended exchange. You're still trying to learn something specific, but the key thing with unstructured interviews is you're going to some extent, follow the lead of the interviewee. If they open a subject that you were not expecting, you're going to go, oh, that sounds interesting, and you're going to give them space to talk about them, ask them a follow-up prompt, whatever, right? So I think it's a more interesting way to interview. It's also much more flexible, and it's also useful to use unstructured interviews when you're not going to interview a ton of people, right? If you're going to interview 100 people, and you really want to be able to see trends and patterns across all 100, then you might want to use structured interviews, right? Because then you can go, okay, 50% of the people said this to question 4. You have more of a sense of those patterns. With an unstructured approach, each interview is going to be unique to a certain extent, which is not a problem, right? A lot of cultural anthropologists are not doing a statistical analysis anyway, so that kind of thing is not as important. You're still going to see patterns, but again, it gives you that sort of flexibility, and it allows you to be responsive to what happens during the conversation, okay? It's nice too, I think, for sort of a beginning interview, as I think some of you are, because I think an unstructured interview can feel more like a conversation, right? Again, you're not just like making it up on the spot, but it allows you to respond to what the interviewee says and sort of continue that path that they've started, okay? All right, so that's the difference between these two kinds of interviews, structured and unstructured. Now, within your unstructured interviews, of course, you're going to have to make some decisions about, well, what exactly might I ask? And there's just a million ways to ask questions, right? So please feel free to be creative and to think about it yourself. I'm not going to give you like a cut and dried formula for how to do your interviews, but let me give you some options and some ideas about kinds of questions, okay? And what I'd suggest overall is when you think about, the questions you're going to write, that you diversify a bit, right? Like, first of all, of course, think about your subject, think about who you're talking to, but also think about asking about your subject from a few different angles, okay? And I think that's what these kinds of interview questions will equip you to do, to ask from different angles, okay? So here's 5, this is not an exhaustive list, this is just some examples. Here's 5 kinds of questions you might ask in an interview, okay? So the first one is what is sometimes called tour questions. The idea with it being a tour is that you're asking your interviewee to provide you with a general overview of the topic. Like imagine a physical tour. It doesn't need to be a physical tour. You can be having this just as a verbal conversation. But the idea is something like, walk me through X subject. Walk me through a day in your job, right? Walk me through this, political issue that you're really focused on, whatever it might be that your topic is, okay? So that's a good starting question often, especially if it's a topic that's new to you. You want this person who is kind of an insider in that cultural phenomenon to tell you what they know, right? You want to sort of give the role of sort of introducing the subject to the person who actually knows a lot about it, right? As interviewers, we're coming into this wanting to learn from other people. So it's often a good idea to start with going, just, tell me what's going on here in a very open way, as opposed to starting with more focused questions that are like our assumptions of what's important, right? So there's one, tour questions. You can also do an example question, which is just what it sounds like. It can often be like a follow-up question, or it can be a standalone question. So if you ask them to do that big tour, and they give you this whole like set of things, and there's something that they talk to you about in a more abstract way, and you want to know concretely or specifically what they mean, you could follow up with an example question. Can you give me an example of that, right? Something that's more sort of on the ground that can illustrate a concept, right? When you ask people about stuff, sometimes they will narrate specific events and circumstances, and sometimes they will talk in more general, abstract terms about stuff. And both things are useful. But one of the ways you can sort of get some of each of those is to use different kinds of questions. So if somebody talks in really general terms about something, you might say, great, thank you. Can you give me an example of this thing? And they might then bring it more down to earth for you. An experience question. This is a way to get at, again, especially if people are talking in general or abstract terms, to get at something that they observed or that happened to them, right? What happened? What did you do that day, right? Tell me how that thing looked to you, right? So more like asking people to be sort of journalists telling you about something that happened in real time, okay? A significance question. This is also useful as a follow-up, but again, it can also just be a separate question that you ask and you planned to ask. It's really about how people experienced or interpreted what happened to them, right? Like, what was the significance to them, right? How did that make you feel? What role did that experience play in your life, et cetera, right? Like, you're trying to get at not only the what happened, what did you see, how are things done, what's a typical day like, but what is meaningful about those things, at least from the perspective of the individual you're talking to at that time, okay? And then the final one I'll throw out there is what I'm calling a native language question, which cultural anthropologists sometimes, quite frequently, work in cross-cultural contexts where they're working in a second language to the interviewer. And, sometimes cultural anthropologists are perfectly fluent or bilingual, right? And they don't have as many of these questions. But if you're not perfectly fluent or bilingual, there might be certain terms or certain usages that are a little bit more complex and that you want to follow up on, right? If somebody uses a turn of phrase or a piece of jargon that is a little bit opaque to you, a good follow-up question is just to ask them to unpack that. Like, what do you mean by that word? You've used this word blank in the last couple of minutes. Can you tell me more about what that means? Now, I use in the first instance, I talked about this in terms of working across languages. Even if you're both speaking the same native language, people in a certain subculture will use language a little differently, right? So again, if there's, you're working with somebody, you speak the exact same language, but they're, talking about a very sort of specific thing that they're into that you are new to, and they use terms associated with that, they might not be totally transparent to you what those words or terms or concepts mean. So a good way to learn about the key concepts that are associated with a certain cultural world or a certain cultural phenomenon is to ask for more info just about the word, right? What does that word mean, right? Or, I get generally what that word means. Can you unpack it a little bit for me? That can be a really useful question too, okay? All right, so again, these are examples. I'm not trying to get you to rigidly structure the way you ask questions in the interviews. I'm trying to give you some tools, okay? So please draw on them as you see fit for what you're going to do, all right? Okay. Now, for both observations and interviews, as I alluded to earlier, one of the things that goes with that when you're doing research is that it's not enough to just like watch the interesting thing and see what's going on or to have the interesting conversation. You need to also sort of bring home something that you can use to write a paper later, maybe months later, right? So you need to document stuff. For observations, as I've already mentioned, two key techniques you'll be using for this class are field notes and photos. Field notes simply being jotting down in as much detail as you can in a notebook, like literally with a pen, or in a phone, or in a laptop, whatever, what you're seeing and hearing, okay? Like that's you just taking notes, right? Photos is the other one you're going to use, right? And again, I think there's lots of ways to use photography, but the basic idea that you can capture a whole bunch of information in one photo that would be harder, more labor intensive to write out. So, if you see a really sort of kind of informationally dense thing in the site where you're observing, that might be a good time to take a photo. What I'm picturing is something like if you were doing your project, say, in a church, a religious altar, which often will have a whole bunch of different stuff associated with it. Taking a picture of that might be really useful because then you can later go, okay, let's see. There's a cloth. There's this religious icon. There's this object over here. There's these stairs, whatever it may be, right? So think about using photos, a combination of field notes and photos, as a good way to record things that you observe. For interviews, I'm going to ask you for part of the assignments that you're doing to digitally record an interview, meaning use your phone or any other recording device. And you can do that for all the interviews you do in this course. And it's, for obvious reasons, a good way to go, right? You have a complete record, assuming that the recording device works. You have a complete record. It's very useful in that regard. That said, I think for both observations and interviews, in general, it's a good idea to always use two things to capture what you're either observing or hearing from your interviews. So for the observations, you're going to use both field notes and photos. For the interviews, in addition to recording interviews, I encourage you to do some note-taking. You can take notes during the interview, like just jotting down like words and phrases, right? You can also take notes after the interview, right? If you want to focus on what's actually being said back and forth, there's nothing wrong with sort of staying in the conversation. But then as soon as the conversation's over and you say like, great, thank you so much, see you later, then you immediately go into your Word doc or whatever and take notes on what you just heard. That's also very effective. You can remember quite a bit if the time difference or the time span between when you do the interview and when you start writing is short, right? That's just a memory issue. If you write notes immediately after or very soon after an interview, you'll be able to remember a lot of stuff, including like direct quotes. If you wait till 3 hours later, you've already lost a little bit. If you wait till the next day, you've lost kind of a lot. If you wait a week, right? I mean, you guys probably have a better memory than I do, but still, right? Some of those details you'll forget. So again, taking notes either during or immediately after the interview is the best way to capture stuff, okay? And again, this is really kind of just partly a backup to what you're recording. Like, if for some unfortunate reason, your recording device doesn't work very well, or there's a lot of noise in that space, and some of the things that the person's saying, it's hard to hear, it's very useful to have those notes, right? The other reason it's useful to have notes in addition to a recording is if you just record something, say you do an hour-long interview, at the end, you've got this file, this audio file, right? To access that information, you need to go back and listen to that whole hour, right? If you've taken notes along the way, you have something you can immediately, right after the interview, you can just glance at and go like, okay, now I've kind of got the main things, right? And I also know where in my recording are the sort of the most important parts. So I can also, it gives you kind of an outline of what you've recorded, so you can also kind of speed ahead if you know like, okay, the most important part of this conversation happens about halfway through. Okay, so it's just a useful complement to the actual kind of audio recording. Okay, so that's my sort of take on ways of capturing the information from these two methods. Okay, now let's get into these linked assignments that I mentioned. Again, this information is also in the syllabus, and the handouts that I'm going to show you now are also all in D2L, okay? So you have the basic information already, but I want to now sort of talk you through them. And the main thing I also want to demonstrate here is that these are 5 separate assignments as far as you doing them and turning them in for the class. But the other way you can think about them is as steps in a bigger project, right? So what you do in each of these first 4 smaller assignments is all going to get folded into that final bigger assignment, which is the final ethnography project, okay? So the whole thing is sort of cumulative. I could have just given you a final ethnography project and given you, steps along the way. I divided it out into smaller assignments because I think it's easier to focus on one step before you move on to the next one. And it just gives you time to do that and me time to give you feedback along the way at each step, okay? So you are going to do these 5 assignments. The first 4 are small ones that will contribute to what you finally turn in for the project at the end of the semester, okay? All right, so let's go through these then in sequence. The first thing you're going to do is this assignment that I'm calling Choose Your Subject. And the reason I'm calling it that is because that's basically what you're going to do in the assignment, okay? This is the handout. So, this is due February 4th. Okay, this is the first one in this sequence. You're going to choose one subject that is going to be the subject you focus on for all of these assignments, okay? I've given you a list to choose from. So you're going to pick one of these subjects. So that's the first thing you're going to do for this assignment. Look at that list. And you may notice that the subjects are subjects that we deal with in the course, right? So they're also subjects you'll be sort of learning about in the course. But that doesn't mean you have to wait till we get to the, to the politics section to choose politics. But it's just, that's where they came from. You're going to choose one of these, okay? That's the first part of this assignment. Then, the second part of this assignment is to then think about 3 interviews and 3 observations you could do that would illuminate that subject for you, okay? For this first assignment, choose your subject. You're not going to do the interviews. You're not going to do the observations. You're just going to tell me your plan. And it can be kind of a sketchy plan at this point. I'll give you feedback, right? But if you look here at what I say on the handout, right, I want you to, again, choose your subject. You're literally going to say, I am going to do, the subject of family for my project. That's it. I just need to know which one you picked. And then I ask you, list 3 interviews and 3 observations you could conduct, right? For the interviews, identify either a particular person or a category of people, right? It is okay to interview people you know. It's also okay to interview people you don't know. And it's also okay to not exactly know specifically who it will be at the stage of this assignment, all right? Mainly what I want you to do is to think about your subject and who would be good people to talk to about that, right? So the example I give you is, if you want to do a project on health, and within that you're really interested in sort of the profession of nursing, you could either say in your list for this assignment, I'm going to talk to my cousin blah blah who's a nurse, or you could just say, I would really like to interview an ER nurse. It's a category. You don't yet know who that person is, and you may not ultimately do that interview. That's fine too. But just think about what what you want to know about your subject and who a good pick for an interview would be based on that. Same with the observations, right? For an observation, you can pick a space, like a place. You can pick a certain event or kind of event. And again, for this first assignment, I just want to see a list of 3 ideas for observations. If you already know, say you choose religion, you already go, you know what I want to do? I want to do my ethnography project on, there's a church that's in my neighborhood that I walk by every day, looks super interesting. I hear music coming out of there. I've never been in there. I want to use my project to learn about that, right? If you've already got that brainstorm, then you might go, okay, here's my observations. I specifically want to go to blah, blah church to observe a Sunday service, say, right? And I want to go to, their choir. I know they have choir practice on Thursday, whatever it might be, right? Or I want to do an observation just of the building itself, right? I want to see if I can go in there and just sort of just kind of look at how the building is constructed, what kind of objects are in there, etc. Right? So it could be very specific like that. Or it could just, if you think I want to do my project on religion and I want to pick some site of religious practice, you could just say that. I want to go observe religious services somewhere in the city. Right? You're going to have to get more specific down the line, but for now, I just want to know that, okay? So I'm giving you some flexibility here. Obviously, the more you can kind of think through it, earlier in the process, the more you'll sort of get some momentum going. But it's okay to sort of still be figuring it out by the time this is due, okay? So that's all you're going to do. This is going to be a very short thing that you turn in. Literally, here's my topic. Here's 3 people or categories of people I think I could interview for this. Here's 3 observations or kinds of observations I could do, right? And write that up in whatever. It's probably going to be less than a page. Submit it as a Word or a PDF doc to the assignment folder, okay? Let me add one more thing about this juncture of the process, this choosing a subject. I'm asking you to choose a kind of a general subject from this list, right? And you don't need to go beyond that for now. But I will say, I think it'll be easier and more satisfying to do the project if you find something that's a little bit more specific within that category, right? So, for example, back to religion. Religion is a huge topic. It would be really hard to study religion in general. What makes more sense is to figure out some kind of piece of the topic of religion that you might study. Again, it can be a specific religious institution that that you physically kind of know where it is. Or it could be some question within religion. I mean, you could say, I'm really interested in people who don't engage in religion. I want to do my interviews about atheists, right? And then the challenge would be what you're going to observe. But there are things you can figure out to do for that. So think about what's the big theme I want to do? And then see if you can think about what might be a little corner of it or a little angle on it that I could do, right? And I think that'll just be a way to sort of bring up some ideas about interviews and observations if you have something a little bit more specific to hang on to. Okay, so that is our first assignment. Choose your subject. The next assignment is called podcast. So you can imagine that now at this point in the process, you've chosen your subject, right? And you are already, we know in that first assignment, we're going to sketch out here's some potential interviewees, right? For this one, you're going to start that process of interviewing. By the time you turn in this podcast assignment, you don't need to have done all 3 of your interviews. You need to have done one, at least one, right? So it's kind of what it sounds like, right? For this one, you're not going to write anything up. You're going to submit an audio file, okay? So we're going to pretend like we're podcasters. And it's not completely a podcast. It's basically just you're going to give me your information in a sort of audio form, okay? There's 2 things I want in that audio file. The first is you're going to interview somebody sort of on tape, if you will, right? We already talked about doing digital recordings of your interviews. So you're going to do one of your interviews. Again, use your phone. There is also, I'll note as kind of a sidebar, within D2L, there's an audio recording function. So you can record something, audio record something through D2L, and then it's already got the file and you just submit it. So that's another option, okay? However you want to do the recording is fine. So you're going to record one of your interviews, right? So it's you talking, the other person talking, right? Then there's a second part. What I say in the instructions is finish your interview, pause the recording, think about the questions I've posed here, and then restart the recording and record yourself responding to these questions. If it ends up being 2 audio files, that's fine too. I don't want to make this like technically complicated for you. It's really just that I think doing this in a sort of oral way will be the most interesting way to do it, okay? So you have the first part of your audio file is going to be your recording of one of your interviews. And again, there's no really no such thing as a bad interview. Some interviews yield more information and some yield less. So don't worry if the interview that you end up recording is kind of short, or the person doesn't really say that much, or whatever. Because part of what you're going to do in the second part is reflect on how it went and what the process was. So for the second part of your recording, I want you to answer the 3 questions on the handout here. First, what problems or successes did you have when you did your interview? Would you do anything differently next time, right? If you do your interview and you go, holy cow, my questions were totally misinterpreted by my interviewee, you can talk about that, right? Number 2, what's the most important thing you learned about doing interviews? So about the method, right? Did you learn it's awkward to have these conversations, or it works well to do this, or whatever it may be, right? And then number 3, what's the most interesting thing your interviewee told you? So specifically that conversation. So number 2 is really about the category of interviewing. If you step back from what you just experienced, what did you learn about interviewing as a research method? The third question is about what exactly happened in that interview? What did you hear from this person that is the most interesting thing? Okay? So again, this is a piece of that sort of process going toward the ethnography project. This one is going to take the form of an audio recording. Okay, so that's our second little assignment. Going back to our list here, the next one is a photo essay. So if the podcast assignment is you doing your first interview and talking about it, the photo essay is you doing at least one of your observations and talking about it, okay? So for this one, again, you're going to do 1 or more of your observations. Remember that you're going to do a total of 3 observations across the semester. And you're going to take some field notes and take some photos, right? As I talked about previously, those are good ways to record things you observe, okay? So by the time you do this assignment, you've already chosen your subject, and you've already at least thought about places or events that you can observe that are connected to your topic, okay? So you're going to do one of those observations, right? And you're going to use writing field notes, kind of jotting down the details of what you are observing. And you're also going to take some photos to sort of back that up, or of things that you think are relevant in your field site, okay? So for this assignment, you're going to turn in several things, right? So podcast, you're turning in that audio recording. For this one, 3 things I want to get from you, right? Right into the assignment folder. I'm asking you to take 5 photos. Submit your 5 photos. Your field notes, right? Whatever you jotted down about what you were observing. If it's a Word doc, you can just submit that. If it's written notes, that's fine. Just take a picture and submit that, right? It's fine. I often take physical notes when I'm observing things, so that's a perfectly fine technique. Just take a picture and submit the picture. And then the third thing is a very brief write-up about what your photos show, essentially, right? So I ask you a question about, first of all, just say, here are my 5 photos. The first one is a picture of, again, back to the idea of you're doing something about a church. Here's a picture of how the pews are organized. Here's a picture of, where people submit their donations, their money. Here's a picture of the altar. Here's a picture of the main religious figure, whatever, right? Just give me your 5 photos and a little blurb about what they show, so I understand where they are, what they are. And then, sort of parallel to the last assignment, I also want you, in your little write-up, to answer a question. Okay, this is a little bit more like stepping back. Okay, we've done 2 methods. Let's compare them a little bit. So the question is, what are the similarities and differences between what you learned from your interview that you did in the last assignment and what you learned from your observation you're doing for this assignment? Okay. One of the things we're trying to get at here is how anthropologists use a sort of combination of methods to collect information, right? In a purposeful way, right? An anthropologist would never just do interviews. And an anthropologist would never just do observations, right? And that's what I want you to think about. Why would we do these 2 different things? How do they complement one another? What does one allow me to learn that the other one doesn't, and vice versa, Okay, so that's the point of that question. All right. So the next step is the analysis. At this point in the semester, right, this is in March, we're now getting into sort of trying to make sense of the information that you've collected, okay? So by this point, you've done 3 interviews, you've done 3 observations, and you have that stuff that we talked about. You've got notes, you've got recordings of the interviews, you have some photos, right? You've got all this sort of stuff. So for this assignment, which is again definitely a step towards the final paper, for the final project, you're going to look at all that stuff and see, are there any themes that are emerging out of all that stuff? This is how cultural anthropologists work. We go collect a lot of sort of detailed, on-the-ground information, and then we look at all of it and go, how can we make sense of this, right? One of the key ways to make sense is to try to find anything that it seems like a pattern, right? So I give you an example, right? Are there any topics, and this is across your interviews and your observations, when you look at the materials, when you re-listen to those interviews, are there any topics that repeat, right? Did more than one of your interviewees say the same thing or something similar, right, about an experience? Did you observe something similar in 2 locations, right? Or, you know, it's even better if you can find a connection across between the interviews and the observations. Did somebody say something in an interview and then you saw that thing acted out when you observed? That would be super interesting, right? So any of that, like where you see sort of a trend, a pattern, okay? So that's one thing you might be looking for when you do this assignment. The other piece that you can think about and look for when you're going through all your material is things that seem important or meaningful or big, right? So, you know, if somebody in the interview sort of, and you can tell, sometimes it'll be sort of a little bit more monotone, like you'll get the same sort of level of enthusiasm for all your questions. Some interviews, you know, on one subject, people will say like, oh my God, that's my favorite part of this whole thing. It's the most interesting, whatever. If you see those sort of moments that are a little more dramatic, where something seems important to the person, significant to that cultural world, etc., meaningful pieces or more meaningful pieces, those would also be things to note, right? So you're looking for, as I say here, both patterns, things that repeat, and things that feel especially meaningful. And I do need you to use your interpretation there, right? It's not cut and dried how we find these things. You're going to have to partly use your own interpretive abilities. So for this assignment, you're going to make a list of those things that you identify, those themes that are repeating or are meaningful, and you're going to write a list of them, and then you're going to choose the top 3, in your opinion, what you think the most important 3 themes are that cut across all the data or material that you've collected, okay? So what you're going to turn in for this assignment, again, it's going to be short. It's probably going to be less than a page. You got 3, you've chosen your 3 best, most important top 3 themes, right? Tell me what the theme is, and then, like, explain it a little bit, right? My theme is, you know, regret about not doing X, right? Like all the people in my field site seem to have this, you know, feeling of regret about something that happened in their neighborhood 20 years ago, whatever it might be, right? So you've got a theme. You can explain to me, like, what is that theme? Like, don't just give me the 2 words, like, tell me what it is. And then I do want you to show me in this little write-up what exactly the evidence is for that theme from your interviewees or your interviews and or observations. One of the most important things about doing this kind of ethnography is you're going to talk about like those broad trends, those themes, those issues that emerge, and you're also going to always connect it to the very specific things that you learned in your field research, right? So I want you to do both those things. List your 3 themes, explain them, and then give me some examples. Like the reason where I found this theme is because interviewee X said this, I observed this, interviewee Y said this other thing that seems related, whatever it might be. Just a few little kind of pieces of evidence, right, that you're going to attach. This does not need to be a lengthy discussion. Again, I think the whole thing will be less than a page. But connect the broader concept or theme to the specific evidence that you collected, okay? All right, so that's your ethnography analysis. And then the final project, okay? And again, this is way down the line. This is due on the last day of the semester or of the term, right? We're going to talk about all this a lot more This is not the only time we're going to talk about this, but this is to give you sort of, again, the overview. So all the things you do in those assignments I've just described are all going to get folded into this final project. The form the final project will take is a 5-page paper, okay? So as I say in the instructions here, right, I include in the instructions like the steps you've already taken. So you chose your subject and you planned your research activities. That was in the choose your subject assignment. Okay, check, we did that. Data collection, right? You did your 3 interviews and your 3 observations. And I give you some details about, how to go about that, some parameters for doing those. Your analysis, right? You've already done that ethnography analysis assignment that we just discussed. That's, again, going to go directly into this final project. So really what you're going to start from when you're drafting out this final ethnography project is the writing process, right? So you're going to take all that information and analysis and sort of all the things you've done, and you're going to put them into the form of a 5-page ethnographic paper. And I give you some parameters for how to do that, including sort of the specific sections of the paper as they'll be sequenced and what you're going to do in each one, right? So your paper will have an introduction, a methodology section, that's where you talk about the research methods you engaged in, an analysis section, which again, this will be basically a revised version of what you did in the previous assignment, the ethnography analysis assignment, right? You already have a draft of it, you stick it in there, we're going to do some revising. And then conclusions, right? Where you try to find, like, are there some bigger points I can make about what I experienced through this project and what I learned, all right? And then I have you do an appendix. The appendix is really kind of a more detailed version of what you say in the methodology section. Or I just want to see a list of, all those interesting research activities you engaged in. Like interview 1 was done, with this person in this location, blah, blah, blah. I will say also, and the information's in here, but just let me note it, one of the things you learn from lecture 2 is also the question about research ethics that cultural anthropologists consider very important. And one of those is protecting your the people who agree to sit down and tell you stuff, right? So when I say I want to know who you interviewed, it doesn't mean I need to know that person's name, their real name. It is perfectly fine to use pseudonyms, meaning sort of made up names to represent somebody, or any other way you can hide who the identity of that person is, okay? So you definitely want to be transparent with anybody you're talking to for this project. We're not going to go through a full, there's a whole process for reviewing research and making sure it's ethically done, where, if you're doing formal research, if I'm doing professional research, I also have people read something about my project and maybe sign a consent form. For a project like this, we don't need to go through that, but I do want you to still think about the ethics of doing research, which means first and foremost, being transparent with people, okay? So you're not going to try to sort of talk to somebody and sort of take the information without telling them what you're up to. You're going to say, hi, I'm a student doing a project, right? I'm not going to share your personal information with anybody else. I can use a pseudonym. The only other person who's going to read the paper is my professor, etc. Are you willing to sit with me? You want to make sure people know who you are and what you're doing, right? That's one of our ethical mandates. So back to the appendix, I don't need to know the actual identity of the person, but I want to know what you did. And I want a little bit more detail. So that's the reason for having an appendix. So this will be a 5-page paper. I think for many of you, the papers will be longer than that, and that's perfectly fine. I do not have any upper limit. 5 pages is a minimum, and I think it'll be hard to cover everything in less than 5. So when we get a little bit closer, we'll talk more about all those sort of things about pulling together the final version of your paper, okay? Alrighty. So that is really the overview of those interrelated assignments. Again, I'm giving you this sort of story for things we're going to do across the rest of this term. So please understand that we're going to do these step by step by step. But I think it's useful for you to understand sort of where we're heading with all of this, so that as you're working on these earlier, smaller assignments, you sort of have it in your mind that it's also contributing to this bigger thing. And you can sort of set up those early assignments to help you when it comes time to writing that final project. Okay, well, I think that's it for now. Of course, as I say, we will talk about all of these assignments and steps more along the way. And also, of course, I'm always more than happy to have individual conversations with you. about what you're thinking about for the project, about any of these individual assignments, etc. So please feel free to get in touch with me. Okay, we'll stop there. Take care. Bye-bye.